Hello, everyone. I know this is take two, but welcome back to Fandomology, where fandoms collide. And we are picking back up Paul's Bedtime Stories, picking up where we left off with Splinter of the Mind's Eye. A little bit of a recap from Chapter 1. Luke and Leia are traveling with R2-D2 and C-3PO to the planet Mimbon, where they're going to try and convince a cell of rebels on the planet to help them convince the planetary governments to join the Rebel Alliance. And they crash landed on the planet in this really bad storm that had some really weird colors and visuals to it. We don't know what that is yet. And we saw Luke's point of view as he's trudging through the swamps of Mimbon. So now we're going to pick back up in Chapter 2. And it looks like, are going to be from Leia's point of view. So here we go. And just like last time, I will cut in at various points and give commentary. So just bear with me on that. Chapter 2. Leia Organa made another half-hearted try at adjusting her rain-slicked hair, then gave up in disgust and peered out at the lush growth surrounding her. After losing all contact with Luke, she'd managed to land hard in this wet hell. Wet hell, that is an oxymoron. She took some measure of comfort in knowing that if Luke had also survived Setdown, he'd try to reach her. After all, his job was to see that she arrived safely at Sir Carpus 4. Angrily, she mused that now she was going to be rather more than slightly late for the conference. A quick examination had indicated that she would no longer have to worry about the malfunctioning port engine, which was now a crumpling, oblong metal shape, incapable of propelling itself or anything else across so much as a light second. The rest of the Y-Wing was in little better shape. She considered looking for Luke, but it made more sense for one of them to wait for the arrival of the other, and she knew Luke would come for her as soon as he was ready. "Pardon me, Princess," said the metal form behind her, "but do you think R2 and Master Luke set down safely in this awful place?" "Of course they did. Luke's the best pilot we've got. If I've made it down, I'm certain he had no trouble." That was a slight lie. What if Luke was lying injured somewhere, unable to move, and she simply sat here awaiting him? Better not to think about that. The vision of a twisted, broken Luke, bleeding to death in the cockpit of his X-Wing, made her insides spin tightly. She slid back the roof of the cockpit once again, her nose wrinkling at the rankness of the dripping morass encircling them. Plenty of noise assailed her from hidden things moving stealthily through the undergrowth. Nothing larger than a couple of brightly hued quasi-insects had shown themselves thus far, however. Her pistol rested comfortably at her hip. Not that she'd need it, secure as she was in the cockpit, whose sliding roof panel she could throw back in place and lock in seconds. She was perfectly safe. 3PO felt otherwise. "I don't like this place, Princess. I don't like it at all." "Relax. There can't be anything out there," she nodded toward the densest growth, "that would find you digestible." A shrill, hooting cry sounded like a sick trumpet close on her left. She jerked around sharply, sucking in a startled breath, but there was nothing there. Her face pressed close by the open port as she strove to penetrate the green-brown wall of vegetation with anxious eyes. When the noise did not recur, she forced herself to relax. "Do you see anything, 3PO? "No, Princess. Nothing larger than a few small arthropods, and I'm scanning with infrared also. That doesn't mean something large and inimical. Inimical. Someone, I'm sure, will tell me how to pronounce that. Couldn't be out there." But you don't see a thing. But you don't see anything?" "No." She was furious at herself. A simple noise had panicked her. Probably only the forlorn cry of some harmless herbivore, and she'd panicked like an infant. It would not happen again. She was angry because whatever had caused them to crash would certainly cause her to miss her scheduled arrival demonstration on Sarkarpus, possibly aggravating the government officials assigned to greet her. She was twice over angry at Luke, angry for not performing a navigational miracle and following her safely down without instruments or control, and angry, most of all, because he'd been right in insisting not to land there. So she sat and fumed silently to herself, alternately conjuring up the curses she'd employ when he finally did arrive, and worrying about what she'd do if he didn't. Ah, whoop. That's literally what it says here. Ah, whoop. Again, the trumpeting sound. Whatever had produced it had not left at all. If anything, the sharp hooting sounded closer. This time, her hand tightened around the pistol. Once more, she examined the surrounding jungle, saw nothing. As she stared, she theorized. Suppose she had misinterpreted that landing beacon somehow. Suppose it was only the barest of automatic installations, and this world was devoid of not only mechanics, but of facilities for organic travelers as well. If Luke was dead, she'd be marooned here alone without any idea of... There was a loud crashing off to her right this time. Swinging around in the seat, she instinctively fired off a burst through the cracked port and was rewarded with the odor of burnt, wet vegetable matter. The muzzle of the pistol remained focused on the carbonized spot. Hopefully she'd hit the thing. Fortunately, she hadn't. "It's me!" a voice shouted, sounding more than a little shaky. She'd barely missed him. "It's me and R2! R2-D2! 3PO clambered out of the cockpit, moved to greet his squat counterpart. "R2, it's good to..." 3PO paused, then continued in a different tone. "What do you think you're doing making me wait like this? When I think of the anguish you've caused me... Luke, are you all right?" He began climbing up the damaged side of the fighter, sat down next to the open cockpit. "Yes, I touched down behind you. I was afraid R2 and I might miss you. I was afraid you..." She stopped, looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I apologize, Luke. I made a mistake in trying to land here." Luke also looked away, embarrassed. "Nobody could have foreseen the atmospheric disturbance that forced us down, Leia." She looked into the jungle. "I managed to plot the location of that homing beacon before my instruments went out completely." She pointed slightly behind them and to her left. "It's back that way. Once we reach the station, we can locate whoever's in charge and arrange for passage off this world." "If there's a station," Luke pointed out mildly, "or anyone in charge of it." "It occurred to me that it might be a fully automated station," she confessed, "but I don't know what else we can do." "Agreed," said Luke with a slow sigh. "We've got nothing to gain by sitting here. I used to believe in miracles. I don't anymore. We can get eaten just as quickly here as we can on the trail." The princess looked downcast. "You've encountered carnivorous life, then?" "No, hardly any life at all, actually. The only animal of any size I confronted," he went on with a slight grin, "took one look at me and ran off like a spooked bantha." He turned, moved to enter the cockpit. "Let's get started while it's still light. I'll give you a hand making up a pack." Carefully, he lowered himself in next to her. As he unlatched her seat, he became conscious of the confined space they were working in. Awkwardly pressed up against him, the princess seemed to take no notice of their proximity. In the dampness, though, her body heat was near palpable to Luke, and he had to force himself to keep his attention on what he was doing. Again, just a quick reminder, this book came out before Empire Strikes Back. In fact, this was supposed to be the sequel if, the case had happened where the original Star Wars performed badly at the box office. So there was not even a thought of Luke and Leia being siblings yet. So keep that in mind. Raising herself from the cockpit, the princess stood on the nose of the fighter and reached down to him. "Hand it up, Luke." He lifted the burgeoning pack. "Too heavy?" he asked as he handed it to her. She slid it onto her back, slipped both arms through the straps, and adjusted the weight before tightening them. The burden of public office was a lot heavier, she shot back. Let's get moving. Briskly scrambling over the side, she let herself drop to the ground, planted her feet, took 2 steps in the direction of the distant beacon, and began to sink. Luke, 3PO! Take it easy, princess. Edging carefully over the same side, he walked out on the intact wing facing her. Luke! Already she was up to her knees in gray muck. If anything, she was beginning to sink faster. Trying to anchor himself with his left hand, Luke reached out with his right from the wing edge. Lean toward me. R2, you lock onto the ship. 3PO, give me your hand. She did as she was told, the motion generating squelching sounds from the bog. Her hand flailed for him, smacking the soft ground many centimeters from his. Rising, he scrambled back to the cockpit and retrieved his walking stick, then returned hurriedly to his prone position on the wing and extended it. Lean toward me, he urged her again. 3PO, you and R2 hold tight, or I'll go in with her. Don't worry, sir, 3PO assured him. R2 added a whistle. She was up to her waist now. On the first try, she missed the pole. The second time, her fingers locked around it, were joined by her other hand. Luke wrapped both hands around his end of the stick and sat up on the wing, leaning back. His feet slid and scraped on the smooth metal. R2, 3PO, pull! Having secured a firm grip on her, the Earth was reluctant to yield its prize. Every muscle in his body taut, Luke struggled to heave and to conjure the force simultaneously. He tried to pull all of his weight behind his arms, behind his desperate pull. A tired sucking noise sounded, and the princess lurched forward. Luke allowed his exhausted arms a brief respite and hyperventilated while he had the chance. You can play toy engine later, the princess admonished him. Pull now! Momentary anger gave him enough energy to pull her the rest of the way clear. Reaching down, he gave her a hand, and then they were both sitting on the edge of the wing. Covered from the ribs down in a packing of green-gray mud and pieces of what looked like dried straw, the princess appeared decidedly unregal. She pushed futilely at the mud, which was drying rapidly to the consistency of thin concrete. She said nothing, and Luke knew anything he might venture would not be terribly well received. Come on, he suggested simply. Taking up his walking stick, he moved to the back side of the wing. Leaning over, he probed at the ground, which displayed no inclination to eat his stick, but still he kept one hand on the wing edge when he stepped off. His feet sank, but only half a centimeter into the spongy loam. Yet the earth here looked no different than the quick clay that had almost taken the princess. She dropped down easily beside him, and soon they were traveling through intermittent patches of half-familiar vegetation. Branches and bushes blocked tired legs, and occasional thorns tore hopefully at them. But Luke's assumption that the ground beneath the taller growths was the firmest held true with gratifying consistency. Even the weighty droids didn't sink into the muck. From time to time, as they hiked along, the princess would dab or push disgustedly at her lower body, which was now solidly caked with the gook. That's a funny word that they used, gook. She slid into. She remained unusually quiet. Luke couldn't tell whether her silence was due to a desire to conserve her strength or embarrassment at her present situation. He tended to think the former. To his knowledge, being embarrassed was not something she was subject to. Frequently they would pause, turn circles, and then match up pointer alignment on their tray comms to ensure they were still marching toward the beacon site. Even if it is an automatic station, he remarked several days later in an effort to cheer her up. Somebody put it down here so they have to maintain it, however infrequently. I saw some pretty big ruins near the place we set down. Perhaps natives are still living in them, or they might be empty. But the beacon could be used for a xenoarchaeological research post. Xenoarchaeological, that's a new one. That's possible, she admitted brightly. Yes, that would also explain why the beacon's not listed. A small scientific outpost could be temporary. And recent, Luke added, excited by the plausibility of his own supposition. Just talking about such a possibility made them both feel better. If that's the case, then even an automated station that's only used on occasion ought to contain an emergency shelter and supply provisions. Heck, there might even be a subspace planetary relay for contacting Sir Carpus 4 when the scientific team is operating here. A cry for help would be a poor way for me to announce my presence, the princess observed, brushing at her dark hair. Not, she added quickly, that I'm going to be particular. I'll settle for arriving in a medical cocoon. They walked on in silence for a while before another question entered Luke's mind. I still wonder, Princess, what caused our instruments to go crazy. That enormous volume of rising free energy we passed through, bolts jumping from sky to ship and then ship back to sky again. I've never seen anything like that before. Nor have I, sir, commented 3PO. I thought I might go mad. And neither have I, admitted the princess thoughtfully. And I've never read of a natural phenomenon like it. Several colonized gas giants have bigger storms, but never with so much color. And big thunderheads are always involved. We were above the thick cloud layer when it happened. Still, she hesitated. The whole thing seemed almost familiar somehow. R2 beeped his agreement. You'd think whoever established that homing beacon in this area would have also put a passage in the transmission warning ships away from the danger. Yes, the princess agreed. Hard to imagine a scientific expedition, or any other kind, being that negligent. The omission, it's almost criminal. She shook her head. That effect. I can almost remember something like it. A diffident smile, then, my head still full of the conference. It should be, Luke thought, full of only one thing, making it to that homing beacon, and hoping there was more there than just a pile of machinery. What he said was, I understand, Princess. Not the Force, but a more ancient, more highly developed sense in man half convinced him they were being watched. He found himself turning rapidly to scan the trees and mist behind them and at each side. Nothing looked back at him, but the feeling refused to go away. Once she spotted him peering hard at a dank corpse. Not corpse. Copse? C-O-P-S-E. I'm seeing a lot of new words for me in this book. Huh. Okay. Here, you know what? I want to look that one up. Just to see what the... Okay. So apparently it's pronounced caps or something? Let me see this. Let me share my screen real quick so that you guys can see what I'm seeing here. A small group of trees. And what does it sound like?
Cops.
Cops. Okay. So same word as basically the police. All right. You learn something new with these stories. Once she spotted him peering hard at a dank copse. Nervous? It was part question, part challenge. You bet I'm nervous, he shot back. I'm nervous and frightened, and I wish to hell we were on Sir Carpus right now. Anywhere on Sir Carpus, instead of trudging through this swamp on foot. Turning serious, the princess told him, one learns to accept whatever events life has in store with the best possible spirits. She stared straight ahead. That's just what I'm doing, Luke confessed, accepting them in the best possible spirits, nervousness and fear. Well, you needn't look at me as if this is all my fault. Did I imply that? Did I say that? Luke countered, a touch more tightly than he intended. She glanced sharply at him, and he cursed his inability to conceal his feelings. He would have been, he decided, a rotten card player or politician. No, but you as much as... Princess, we still have a long way to go according to your plotted location. Just because something full of teeth and claws hasn't pounced on us from every tree doesn't mean such creatures don't thrive here. One thing we haven't got is time to fight between ourselves. Besides, responsibility is a dead issue now. It's been superseded by survival. Survive we will if the Force is with us. There was no reply. That in itself was encouraging. They trudged on, Luke stealing admiring glances at her when she wasn't looking. Disheveled and caked with mud from the waist down, she was still beautiful. He knew she was upset, not at him, but at the possibility they might miss the scheduled conference with the Sir Carposian underground. There's no night so dark as a night filled with fog, and every night on Mimban was like that. They made a bed for themselves between the parted roots of a great tree, while the princess started a fire, and the droids constructed a rain shelter by stretching the two survival capes between both massive roots. They huddled together for warmth and watched the night try to slip around the edges of the fire. It crackled reassuringly, despite the mist, as the night sounds chorused around them. There were no different from day sounds, but anything that wears the cloak of night, especially on an alien world, partakes of the night's mystery and terror. "Don't worry, sir," said 3PO. "R2 and I will keep watch. We don't require sleep, and there's nothing out there that can ingest us." Something sounded like a broken pipe gurgled stentorianly. That's another one I gotta look up. Hold on 1 second. Loud and powerful. Let me see if I got the pronunciation right. Okay. Yes. Back to it. Something sounded like a broken pipe gurgled stentorianly in the darkness, and 3PO started. R2 gave a derisive beep, and the two droids moved out into the darkness. "Very funny," 3PO admonished his companion. "I hope one of the local carnivores chokes on you and breaks every one of your internal sensors." R2 whistled back, sounding unimpressed. The princess pressed close against Luke. He tried to comfort her without appearing anxious, but as the darkness closed to a Stygian blackness around them, and the night sounds turned to sepulchral moans and hootings, his arm instinctively went around her shoulder. She didn't object. It made him feel good to sit there like that, leaning against her, and trying to ignore the damp ground underneath. Something called out with an abyssal shrillness, startling Luke from his sleep. Nothing moved beyond the dying fire. With his free hand, he tossed several shards of wood onto the embers, watched the fire blaze again. Then he happened to glance down at his companion's face. It was not the face of a princess and a senator, or a leader of the Rebel Alliance, but instead that of a chilled child. Moistly parted in sleep, her lips seemed to beckon him. He leaned closer, seeking refuge from the damp green and brown of the swamp and that hypnotic redness. They were going to kiss. He hesitated, pulled back. She was an aristocrat and rebel leader. For all he'd accomplished above Yavin, he was still only a pilot, and before that, a farmer's nephew. Peasant and princess, he mused disgustedly. His assignment was to protect her. He wouldn't abuse that trust, no matter his own hopeless hopes. He would defend her against anything that leapt out of the darkness, crawled from the slime, dropped from the gnarled branches they walked under. He would do it out of respect and admiration, and possibly out of one of the most powerful of emotions, unrequited love. Again, before Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. So, in everyone's mind, they were still not related. He would defend her from himself, he determined tiredly. In 5 minutes, he was fast asleep. Any awkwardness was spared by the fact that he awakened first. Removing his arm from her shoulders, he nudged her gently, once, twice. With the third nudge, she sat straight up, eyes wide and staring with sudden wakefulness. She turned sharply to stare at him. Then the events of the past several days came flooding back to her, and she relaxed a little. Sorry, I thought I was someplace else. I was a little frightened. She started to rummage through her survival pack, and Luke did the same with his. 3PO offered a cheerful, "Good morning," while the cloud-masked sun rose somewhere behind them, warming the mists slightly. They shared a meager breakfast of emergency cube concentrates. Whoever created these, she grimaced in distaste, biting off a small piece of a pink square, must have been part machine. They didn't program anything like taste or flavor into them. Luke tried not to let the awful taste he was experiencing show. Oh, I know. They were designed to keep you alive, not taste good. And I can somewhat relate to that. Anyone that was in the military or that has eaten an MRE is probably imagining that. Want another one? She extended a blue square with the consistency of dead sponge. Luke eyed it, half smiled queasily. Not right away. I'm kind of full. She nodded knowingly, then smiled. And by the way, hello to DJ Ronnie G, who says, quote, "I like the yellow one." I'm going to guess that this is a quote from the book. Let's see if it pops up. He grinned back at her. The long day never truly grew comfortable, but their suits and the thermal capes kept them warm enough. Real quick, DJ Ronnie G says, yeah, I had a bad MRE a couple months ago. I will say this, though. There are some MREs that are good. Like, if you know, the Chili Mac MRE is the best one. And if I'm not mistaken, the vegetarian omelet is the worst. And he says it's a Stargate SG-1 reference, a similar situation. Fair enough. Okay. The long day never truly grew comfortable, but their suits and the thermal capes kept them warm enough. By late morning, it had grown sufficiently hot for them to unhook the capes, fold the thin material into small rectangles, and put them up in suit pockets. The rare breaks in the mist were never large enough to give them a view of the rising sun, though 3PO and R2 assured them that it was there. It attacked the mist persistently, raising the light level from mere dimness to a kind of enthusiastic twilight. We should be getting close to the beacon, she told them all around midday. Luke wondered how many hours they'd slept. Nights and days would be long on Sir Carpus/Mimbon. We have to be prepared to find nothing, Princess. There might not be a beacon station. I know, she admitted quietly. We have to search, though. We can walk in an expanding spiral from the place I plotted and hoped. A long wall of trees and lesser growth lay ahead. They plunged into it without hesitating, trading ease of passage for secure footing. Pardon me, sir? Luke looked slightly ahead and to his right. Both robots had paused, and C-3PO was leaning against something. What is it, 3PO? Your pardon, sir, but this isn't a tree I'm pressing against, the droid said. It's metal. I thought the matter worthy enough to bring to your notice. There's a possibility. A loud beep cut him off, and he glared down at R2. Talk too much? What do you mean I talk too much, you factory second? Metal. It is metal. The princess was standing alongside the robots, waiting for Luke to make his way through the brush. R2, see if you can clear some of this undergrowth away. The little droid activated a small cutting flame, used it to burn a path through the jungle. It's a wall. It's gotta be, Luke muttered as they walked parallel to the forest-scarred metal surface. Sure enough, the metal finally ended, and they emerged from the trees onto a modestly cleared roadway. It led to a street paved with packed clay earth. Buildings lined both sides of the glorified alley, marching resolutely into the swirling fogs. Warm yellow glows shone from lights hidden behind tightly sealed windows, illuminating and outlining raised metal sidewalks canopied against the mist and rain. Thank the Force, the princess muttered. First, Luke began, we find a place to get cleaned up. Then, he took a step forward. A hand caught his shoulder, held him back. He eyed Leia curiously. What's the matter? Think a minute, Luke, she urged him softly. Excuse me. This is more than just a simple homing beacon site. Much more. She cautiously leaned around the corner of the metal wall, peered down the street. Figures were strolling along the metal walkways now. Others crossed the mist-slicked street. It's too substantial for a scientific post, too. Luke turned his own attention to the shrouded streets, took in the figures, the crude shape of the structures. You're right. It's a big installation. Maybe some company from Sir Carpus. No, she gestured sharply. Look there. Two figures were swaying down the center of the street. They wore armor instead of loose clothing, formed armor of white and black, armor that was all too familiar. Both men carried their helmets casually. One dropped his, bent to retrieve it, kicked it accidentally up the street. His companion chided him. Cursing, the clumsy Imperial picked up his helmet, and the two continued along their meandering path. Luke's eyes had grown as wide as Leia's. Imperial stormtroopers here? Without the Sir Carposian's knowledge, or we'd have heard of it from the underground there. She was nodding excitedly. If the Sir Carposians find out, they'll quit the Empire faster than a bureaucrat can quote forms. And who's going to inform them about the violation? Luke wanted to know. Why, the princess stopped, looking somber. We have two reasons to need help now, Luke. Shh, he whispered. They drew back further into the darkness. A large cluster of men and women appeared around the near corner. They were chatting softly amongst themselves, but it wasn't their inaudible conversation that intrigued Luke and Leia. They wore unusual clothing, coveralls of some black reflective material, which tucked into matching high boots. The coveralls rose to end with a cap that fit over the wearer's head. Some members of the group had their hoods up and fastened formed. Others wore them folded flat against their upper back. Various types of equipment Luke didn't recognize hung and swayed from wide belts. Evidently, the princess knew what they were. Miners, she informed him, watching as the group moved off down one metal walkway. They're wearing mining suits. The Empire's digging something valuable out of this planet, and the Sir Carposians don't know a thing about it. How can you be so sure? Luke inquired. The princess sounded positive. They'd have their own installation here and no troops. The Empire obviously doesn't want anyone to know about this. R2 whistled soft agreement. Further conversation was made impossible when the air was suddenly filled with a distant, violent howling. It sounded like a parade of demons trampling along just beneath the surface. The sound continued for several minutes and ceased. Realization transformed the princess's expression. Energy mining, she explained breathlessly to Luke. They're using some big generators here. A thoughtful pause, then. That might account for the atmospheric disturbance which forced us down. I knew I'd read about that effect somewhere. A ship has to be specially insulated to drop down through an area where an energy drill is working. Byproducts include excessive charges, and they're shunted away skyward. But the fallout materials, if this world supports a native race, it's illegal, that kind of mining. Since when, observed Luke bitterly, did legalities ever matter to the Empire? You're right, of course. We can't stand here forever, he went on. First thing we have to do is obtain some substantial food. Those concentrates can keep you alive for only so long without some protein to work with. And, he added, glancing at her muddy exterior, we've got to get cleaned up. We can't attract any attention. Since Yavin and the Death Star were both well known to Imperial enforcement officials, we'd be taken on sight. He studied her pilot suit, then his own. We can't go strolling around town in these. I think we'd better work on stealing a change of clothing. Steal? The princess objected, drawing herself up. From a possibly honest shopkeeper. If you think for a minute that a former princess of the royal house of Alderaan, a senator, is going to resort to... Time out for a second. I had a funny thought reading that part, especially where it's like a former princess of the royal house of Alderaan, a senator. I was imagining Luoxana Troy in my head right now. I am Luoxana Troy, first daughter of the house of whatever she says. Let me look it up. She is, okay, here's the actual quote. Luoxana Troy, daughter of the fifth house, holder of the sacred chalice of reeks, and heir to the holy rings of Beta Zed. I had to look that up, because if I got that wrong, it would have bugged me. Back to the story. I'll steal them, Luke said curtly. He leaned around the metal corner. The mist-shrouded street was momentarily deserted, and he beckoned for her to follow. They hugged the walls of the buildings, trying to pass quickly before any lit windows or open doors, slipping furtively from shadow to shadow. Luke hastily examined each storefront in passing. Finally, he halted, indicated the sign above a doorway. And DJ Roddy G said, "Word." "Minor supplies," he whispered. "This is what we want." While the princess watched the walkways, he tried to peer through one dark window. "Maybe it's a holiday?" he guessed hopefully. "More likely the only establishments open this time of night sell nothing but intoxicants," the princess pointed out prosaically. "What now?" She looked uncomfortable. By way of reply, Luke led her around back. The rear entrance he'd hoped for was there, but it was secured, as he'd feared. I just lost my place. By way of reply, Luke led her around back. The rear entrance he had hoped for was there, but it was secured as he'd feared. To complicate matters, there was a broad open lane behind the buildings, from which the jungle and bog had been shunted away. If anyone happened to come walking past here, they'd have nowhere to hide. "Wonderful," the princess observed as Luke tried the locked portal. "How do we get in?" She was indicating the seamless metal door, which, no doubt, was locked and controlled from the inside. The back of the building was devoid of windows, possibly to foil intentions such as theirs. Luke removed the lightsaber from his waist, very slowly adjusted the controls set in the handle. "What are you going to do, Luke?" "I don't know how big this town is, but a noisy break-in would attract too much attention, so I'm trying not to be noisy." Watching with interest, the princess took a couple steps back, looking nervously up and down the alleyway. Any second, she expected to see a squad of angry troopers racing around a corner toward her, alerted by some hidden alarm that they had unknowingly triggered. Only jungle sounds reached her, however, as Luke activated his saber. Instead of the meter-plus shaft of white energy, the pommel put forth a short, needle-thin spoke. That's interesting. So, time out for a second. What was just described there is Luke adjusting both the length and the width of his lightsaber blade. And again, it's interesting that something like that existed this early in at least EU Star Wars canon. Because the only instance of someone being able to modify the blade of their lightsaber like that I'm aware of is Dooku. So I'll use my lightsaber here as an example. So Dooku, of course, he had a curved lightsaber. This is straight. But obviously, here would be the main activation button. If I was to have the same surprise second button that Dooku did, here would, of course, be the main activation button. But then on the other side here would be a button that I could either double or shorten the length with in a surprise attack. So Dooku was able to have a shorter blade, I believe, at first for attacking. And then as he goes to lunge, he would activate that second button and I guess lengthen it to catch his opponent off guard and, of course, end the fight. So that's the only instance that I'm aware of where you can change the... Oh, wait, hold on. No, I take it back. There's another instance of that, too, in Rebels, where Ezra's getting his first training with a lightsaber, and of course he's borrowing Kanan's lightsaber, and Kanan presses something on the side of the hilt to shorten the blade ever so slightly to make it his size. All that to say, of course, like I said, it's just interesting that the ability to change a lightsaber's blade length, and I'm guessing width now too, it's interesting that this was thought of as far back as 1978. Back to the story. With concentration worthy of a master craftsman, Luke stepped forward and moved the energy beam along the slight space visible between door and frame. A third of the way down, a distant click sounded, and the door slid obediently aside. Readjusting his saber, Luke flicked it off and replaced it at his waist. "Go ahead," she told him. "The droids and I will keep watch." He nodded, vanished inside. Luke's principal objective was conveniently located close to the back of the store. He spent several minutes scrounging through the racks before he found what he wanted. Taking the well-used clothing, he hurried to the back entrance and tossed the booty to the princess. Yes, they used the word booty. Wait, I read that already. Then he stepped just outside the door, reached back in, and touched the close stud. He pulled his arm clear as the door slid shut behind him. With luck, it might be several weeks before the storekeeper discovered his loss. Well pleased with himself, Luke stepped down to the ground and began unsnapping his flight suit. He was partially undressed when he paused and noticed the princess standing and staring at him. "Come on, we have to hurry." She put hands on seal-curved hips, cocked her head to one side, and stared meaningfully at him. "Oh," he murmured, half smiling. He turned away and continued undressing. Feeling that nothing had changed behind him, he sneaked a glance, saw the princess still eyeing him uncomfortably. She sounded embarrassed. "What's wrong, princess?" She sounded embarrassed. "Luke, I like you, and we've known each other for a while, but I'm not sure I can trust you now." He grinned. "You know it won't make any difference if the stormtroopers find us here in our flight suits. You can change in the bush." Turning away from her, he continued changing his own attire. She looked back at the nearby jungle. Tiny yellow points of light, the eyes of unknown creatures, winked on and off in the bushes. Strange, discomforting sounds hissed and bleated at her. She sighed, started to slip out of her own flight suit, then paused. "Well, what are you two staring at?" "Oh, sorry, an insistent whistle. "Yes, you're right, R2. Both droids turned away from the princess. Shortly, Luke was able to turn and study her approvingly. He's checking her out. Her simple worn suit was a bit snug, but otherwise looked quite natural on her. "Well," she asked, obviously not enthralled with her new wardrobe, "what are you staring at?" "I think maybe something in a print," he began. He had to react quickly to duck the boot she threw at him. It clattered off the metal door. "Sorry," he told her, sounding like he meant it as he picked up the boot. Bending over his old suit, he began transferring various items from it and from his backpack to the belt patches on the miner's uniform. One small case he flipped open carefully, went rapidly through its contents before snapping it shut and slipping it into a pocket. I've got enough Imperial currency to last us a while. You? She glanced away from him. What would a representative of the Alliance be doing with common courtesy on a diplomatic mission? Luke sighed. We'll make do, I suppose. How would you like something to eat besides a concentrate? She faced him, visibly more cheerful. I could eat half a cho-cho, Luke. No idea what a cho-cho is. Are you sure we ought to, though? We have to mingle sometime. As long as we don't look or act like total strangers, no one should bother us. They started back toward the main street after burying their packs and flight suits in a syrupy bog. They were halfway there when the increasing light caused Luke to stop. What's the matter? The princess asked, looking worried. Two things, Luke insisted, eyeing her. First of all, there's your walk. And what's wrong with my walk? Nothing, that's the trouble. Her brows drew together in puzzlement. I don't follow you, Luke. He explained slowly. You're walking like a princess, not like a working woman. Slump your shoulders, take some of the confidence and distance out of your stride. Stagger a little. You gotta walk like a tired mineral grubber, not like one of the Imperial family. And then there's the second thing. Reaching out, he tousled her neat hairdo violently. Hey, she objected, struggling. When he stepped back, her hair formed a nebulous maze of undisciplined strands around her head and face, the intricate double bun she'd worn now completely obliterated. That's better, he observed, but there's still something not right. After a moment, he reached down, picked up a handful of moist earth, then stepped toward her. Oh no, she warned him, putting up both hands defensively and moving backward. I've been living in sludge for days. I'm not letting you smear that gunk on me. Have it your way, Leia. He dropped the dirt and it hit the ground with a loud splat. You do it. The princess hesitated. Then, using spit in hands and a minimum of dirt, she succeeded in wiping every trace of makeup from her face and dirtying it as little as possible. How's this? She asked, guardedly. Luke nodded approvingly. Much better. You look like someone who's been out in the desert too long without water. Thanks, she muttered. I'm beginning to feel like it, too. It's necessary. I just want to see us get off this world alive. We won't if you don't find that food you mentioned. He had to hurry to catch up with her as she started heading toward the street. All right, so that is chapter 2. And again, we get just a little bit of a sort of closing thoughts before we end. I like how we get more of Luke and Leia's relationship with each other as time's going on. And we get a glimpse into the fact that, yes, Luke was at the time thinking about perhaps being more than friends with Leia. I'll say it one more time. This is before Empire Strikes Back. This is certainly before Return of the Jedi. So the idea of Luke and Leia being siblings was not on anyone's mind. In fact, I want to say it wasn't even on George Lucas's mind yet. I know that he did want Luke to have a sister, but it wasn't going to be Leia. I think it would have been someone else, and in his version of the sequel trilogy, that's probably who the sequel trilogy was going to focus on. But that's neither here nor there. I mention all of that because it's interesting seeing how Luke was looking at her at that point before, he knew what he knew. And obviously, Carrie Fisher, back in the late 70s, early 80s, was a very attractive woman. And so, yeah, Luke, it's not hard to believe at all that Luke would find himself falling in love with Princess Leia at the time. And of course, the two of them having to rely on each other to survive definitely makes sense. One thing that is different than I remember is, well, not that I remember, but different than I'm used to, we'll say, is C-3PO being a little bit more cheerful so far in this story than he is before. Like, suppose C-3PO, just hypothetically, went to Dagobah with Luke and R2. He would have been complaining about the swamp left and right. I mean, he was doing that about Tatooine, you know, the classic, I've got to rest before I fall apart. My joints are almost frozen. He did the same thing with Hoth, and I'm pretty sure he did the same thing with Endor. So it's a little different to see C-3PO not really minding the environment that he's in. Although I'm sure that could change. And then, of course, the idea that the Empire is energy mining illegally on a planet, that's definitely something I could see. That's definitely something I could see them doing. And the byproducts of the energy mining being that weird Aurora Borealis type stuff that they flew through and got crashed in the first chapter, it definitely makes sense that there would be some byproduct energy that would get released up into the atmosphere that would cause some form of disturbance. So far, I'm really enjoying this. I'll admit, it's very wordy, but then again, you're also talking to someone that has lost a lot of his ability to sit down and read a book for long periods of time. I know I've too much time with technology. But we're going to pick this up, let's say next Saturday night. Next Saturday night is part 3, if not sooner. I don't know yet when. But I do want to close this stream out with saying this. As I said last time, DJ Ronnie G says, yeah, this was a good audiobook experience. Thank you. And I do want to say also, guys, I appreciate you guys coming on to listen. And I want to encourage you guys with the future parts to leave some of your own commentary to what I'm reading too, and we'll discuss it. But I also want to mention one last thing before we sign off. So my friend, Mr. John Jenkins, who works as the IT person or one of the IT people at my job, he made me an offer that I could not refuse today, because he's the one who initially loaned me this book. He made me an offer because he liked hearing part 1, and basically said to me that if you can complete this book, he wants me to continue doing streams with it. If I can complete this book, then he will give it to me for keeps. So I am for sure going to continue reading this book to you guys on stream. I don't know exactly how much further. I mean, that's how far we've gotten. Here's, of course, the bookmark. So we still got a decently good size ways to go. But with that, we are going to go ahead and stop for the night. So thank you guys for watching. Make sure to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. Virginia says, do voices next stream, Mr. Audiobook. I will do my best. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. Make sure to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. And just remember, everyone, the Force is family. See you guys later.